I never thought I'd be the woman telling her husband that he needed to either step up and raise another man's baby or get out of my life. But looking back, I don't regret how things played out, just how they ended up. I'm Lena, 32, and this is the story of how I meticulously, unintentionally, blew up my entire world. 5 years ago, I married Silas. He was the human equivalent of a warm blanket on a Sunday afternoon, comfortable, safe, and utterly predictable. He wasn't what I had pictured for myself in my more adventurous teenage daydreams. He was socially awkward, with a tendency to talk far too long about the intricacies of his computer programming job, a subject that could anesthetize even the most caffeinated listener. He had this strange, high-pitched laugh that would erupt at odd moments, causing heads to turn in quiet restaurants. But he was stable. He had a decent job, a 401 gay, and he looked at me like I was the single most fascinating creature on the planet. He'd never had a serious girlfriend before me, which I'd initially seen as a major plus. No baggage, no ghosts of exes past, no one to compare me to. I was his one and only. The pedestal he placed me on was comfortable, but over time, the air up there grew thin. We had agreed early on that we didn't want kids. At least, I didn't want them, not then, and Silas, in his typical fashion, went along with whatever I wanted. That should have been my first major clue about the foundational cracks in our relationship. He never pushed back, never argued for his own desires. It was like dating a human nodding dog, and the affirmation, once so soothing, began to grate on my nerves faster than I could have imagined. 3 years into our marriage, the little things started to feel like insurmountable obstacles. The way he chewed his food with a quiet, persistent smacking sound. The bizarre collection of fantasy figurines that occupied prime real estate in our shared home office. The way he'd interrupt a perfectly normal conversation to explain a concept no one had asked about, his eyes wide with an earnestness I was beginning to find infuriating. It wasn't a single dramatic event. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts. Meanwhile, my social media feeds were a curated gallery of lives I wasn't living. Friends were posting photos from spontaneous trips to Costa Rica, celebrating promotions at exciting startups, or sharing candlelit selfies with partners who looked at them with a mixture of passion and adoration. I looked across the dinner table at Silas, who was explaining the virtues of a new coding language, and a cold dread washed over me. Had I settled? Had I traded passion for predictability and, in doing so, signed away my one chance at a truly vibrant life? That's when the idea of the vasectomy took root. I brought it up during dinner one night, my tone deliberately casual, sandwiched between a comment about the pasta and a question about his day. It would be so much better for us, Si. I hate being on birth control. It messes with my hormones, and it just makes more sense for you to get a simple procedure than for me to keep dealing with the side effects. He hesitated, a forkful of spaghetti hovering mid-air. That hesitation irritated me more than a flat-out refusal would have. I don't know, Lena. What if we change our minds someday? I rolled my eyes so hard I nearly saw my own brain. We've talked about this for years. Neither of us wants kids. Are you suddenly changing your mind? I knew he wasn't. Silas didn't like permanent decisions. He was a man who spent 20 minutes in the cereal aisle, paralyzed by choice. But I needed this from him. I needed to know he was truly committed to our plans, the plans I had laid out for us. After a week of what I called gentle pressure, though, in hindsight, it was more like a relentless campaign, he agreed. I scheduled the appointment myself, drove him there, and sat in the waiting room, flipping through a year-old magazine while he was inside. He was in pain for days afterward, and I played the part of the doting, dutiful wife, bringing him ice packs and his favorite snacks. But inside, a profound sense of relief washed over me. I felt like I had secured something, like I had locked a door on a future I didn't want. Looking back now, I realized the truth was darker. I never actually wanted Silas to be the father of my children, if I ever decided to have any. I just didn't know it consciously at the time. All I knew was that his vasectomy felt like freedom. Freedom from accidents, freedom from a lifetime tied to someone who just wasn't my type. The irony, of course, is that I had no idea that this manufactured freedom would lead me straight into the biggest trap of my life. I wasn't planning to cheat. I definitely wasn't planning to get pregnant. But 3 months after Silas's surgery, a man walked into my life and set fire to my carefully constructed, sterile world. My company was undergoing a major office renovation, and they hired outside contractors to manage the project. That's when Ryder walked in. He was younger than me, 28 to my 32, but he carried himself with a quiet, coiled confidence that made everyone in the room take notice. Unlike Silas, when Ryder spoke, people actually wanted to listen. He had an aura of success that was almost tangible, from the expensive, understated watch on his wrist to the efficient way he directed his crew. I found out later that he owned the entire construction company and made at least 3 times what Silas did. The first time he came to my desk to ask about the layout for my department space, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. That stomach-flipping, breath-catching jolt of pure, unadulterated attraction. We ended up talking for almost an hour, the blueprints completely forgotten between us. When he finally left, my coworker leaned over her cubicle wall and whispered, "Girl, he was so into you." I feigned shock, as if the thought hadn't been screaming through my own mind for the past hour. That night, at home, Silas talked for 45 uninterrupted minutes about a new video game he was excited about. I nodded and smiled, my mind replaying Ryder's easy grin and the way his eyes had held mine. For the first time in my marriage, I allowed the dangerous question to surface. What if I made a mistake? What if there was something better out there for me? 2 weeks later, I started staying late at work. I told Silas it was because the renovation project required my input, which wasn't a complete lie. What I omitted was that these late-night meetings usually ended up with just Ryder and me, poring over plans that somehow always required us to sit very, very close together. The first time we crossed the line, it was so cliché I'd be embarrassed to tell anyone. We were alone in the conference room after everyone else had gone home. He reached over to point at something on the blueprint, his forearm brushing against mine. The contact was electric, a jolt that seemed to suck all the air out of the room. When he looked up at me, his eyes dark with intent, I knew exactly what was going to happen. And I did nothing to stop it. "You know I'm married, right?" I breathed after our first kiss. The words weren't born of guilt, but of a strange need to ensure he understood the stakes. He just smiled that confident, infuriating smile. "That's not my problem, Lena, but is it yours?" I should have said yes. Instead, I pulled him back to me. After that, we fell into a routine. I invented late meetings, girls' nights, work emergencies. I would leave the quiet stability of my home and drive to Ryder's sleek, downtown apartment, a place that smelled of leather and expensive cologne. Poor, clueless Silas would text me things like, "Miss you," or "Brought home your favorite takeout." I'd read them in Ryder's bed, then walk back into my house hours later, kissing Silas's cheek with the same lips that had just been all over another man. Was it wrong? Absolutely. Did I care in the moment? Not in the slightest. Ryder made me feel alive in a way Silas never had. He was unapologetic, decisive, and he took what he wanted without asking for permission. The contrast between them was almost laughable. Silas would ask if the thermostat in our house was set to a comfortable temperature for me, while Ryder was bending me over his granite kitchen counter without a word. The physical part was incredible, but what was even more intoxicating was the risk. Every lie I told, every fabricated story I spun, sent a thrilling rush through my veins. I was getting away with it, right under the nose of a man whose defining characteristic was his unwavering trust in me. One night, things got careless. We'd had a few drinks at a bar near his place, and when we got back to his apartment, things escalated quickly. When he asked about protection, I just whispered, "Don't worry about it." The look on his face, that mixture of surprise and raw hunger, was worth any risk. Afterwards, he casually handed me some cash. "For Plan B," he said, his tone matter of fact. "Get it tomorrow." That became our new normal. It should have felt demeaning, but there was something about his blunt, transactional nature that I found powerful. Over the next few months, he probably spent close to $800 on those little pills. "I should buy stock in the company at this point," he joked once, and I laughed like it was the funniest thing I'd ever heard, all while my real life, my quiet, stable, loving husband, waited for me at home. 4 months into my affair with Ryder, my period was late. At first, I dismissed it. My cycle had always been a little irregular, and we'd been using Plan B every single time. But after 2 weeks, a knot of unease began to tighten in my stomach. I bought a test, telling myself it was just to ease my mind. When those 2 pink lines appeared, bold and undeniable, I didn't feel the panic I expected. Instead, a strange sense of inevitability settled over me, as if on some subconscious level, I'd known this was coming. I sat on the cool tile of the bathroom floor, staring at that positive test, and the most ridiculous thought popped into my head. The universe wanted this to happen. I know how insane that sounds. The universe didn't make me cheat on my husband. The universe didn't make me forget to take the pill that one time I was too tired and figured one slip-up wouldn't matter. But in that moment, the idea that this pregnancy was somehow meant to be gave me a bizarre sense of peace. It absolved me of responsibility. The real question was, what the hell was I going to do now? It took me exactly 3 hours to formulate a plan. A cruel, meticulous, and utterly deceptive plan. Silas's vasectomy had been just over 6 months ago. My obsessive Googling had informed me that there was a tiny, minuscule chance of recanalization of the vas deferens spontaneously reconnecting. It wasn't common, but it happened. It was just enough plausible deniability to build a fortress of lies around. I started that very night. Silas was surprised when I initiated intimacy for the first time in months, but he certainly wasn't complaining. I made a whole production of it. Candles, lingerie, the works. I played the part of a wife rediscovering her passion. When the time came, I begged him to finish inside me, whispering that I missed the feeling of closeness. The confusion on his face was priceless. This was the same woman who had practically dragged him to the urologist to avoid this very scenario. "Are you sure?" he asked, ever my cautious, considerate Silas. "Yes," I breathed, my voice filled with a fake, trembling desire. "You're snipped anyway, remember? Nothing can happen. Except something already had." And I needed to cover my tracks. For the next 2 weeks, I was the perfect wife. I cooked his favorite meals, I stopped criticizing his weird habits, and I initiated sex almost every night, always insisting he finish inside me. The poor guy thought we were having some kind of marital renaissance. "What's gotten into you lately?" he asked one morning, looking happier and more relaxed than I'd seen him in years. I just smiled mysteriously. "Just remembering why I fell in love with you." The guilt should have eaten me alive. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, when he would rest his hand on my stomach while we watched TV, a sharp twinge of it would pierce through my resolve. But then I would remind myself that this was for the best. Silas had quietly admitted, before I'd pushed for the vasectomy, that he thought he might want to be a father someday. I was just giving him what he secretly wanted, right? What he didn't know wouldn't hurt him. When I was about 6 weeks along, enough time to make the timing believable, I staged the grand reveal. I took another pregnancy test while Silas was home. I made a show of walking out of the bathroom, my hand trembling for effect. "Silas," I said, my voice cracking, "I think you need to see this." The range of emotions that crossed his face as he stared at the positive test nearly broke me. First, utter confusion. Then, disbelief. And finally, a wave of such pure, heartbreaking joy that it felt like a physical blow. "But how?" he whispered, his eyes wide and shining. I shrugged, perfecting my performance of innocent bewilderment. "I guess your vasectomy failed. It happens sometimes, according to the internet." "Oh." He pulled me into his arms, and I felt his tears hot on my shoulder. "I can't believe it," he kept saying, his voice thick with emotion. "We're going to be parents." The next day, he called his mother, who shrieked so loudly with excitement that I could hear her through the phone. She had always wanted grandchildren and had been visibly disappointed by our child-free plans. "It's a miracle," she told Silas. "God has blessed you both." "Yeah, a miracle named Ryder," I thought. But I just smiled and pretended to be just as surprised and thrilled as everyone else. The next 5 months were a masterclass in deception. Silas threw himself into the role of expectant father with an enthusiasm that should have melted my heart, but instead, it just filled me with a low-grade, constant anxiety. He read every baby book he could find, his brow furrowed in concentration as he learned about sleep schedules and diaper-changing techniques. He single-handedly converted our spare room into a nursery, painting the walls a soft, gender-neutral yellow and assembling a crib with painstaking precision. He even started a college fund before I'd finished my first trimester. "Do you think he'll have your eyes?" he would ask, gazing at my growing belly with an expression of pure adoration. Maybe I'd answer noncommittally, quickly changing the subject. His mother was even worse. She would visit and speculate endlessly about which family traits the baby would inherit. The men in our family all have that distinctive nose, she'd say, pointing to Silas's slightly upturned feature. And our hairline's strong genes there. Each comment was like a tiny needle of guilt, pricking at the fragile bubble of my lie. But I'd come too far to back down now. Meanwhile, Ryder had completely ghosted me. My initial texts informing him of the pregnancy had been met with a furious phone call. "Did you even take the pills every time?" he'd yelled. "Because this shouldn't have happened." "Of course I did," I lied, feeling defensive. "Look, I believe everything happens for a reason. The universe wanted this baby to exist." That's when I saw a side of him I'd never seen before. He laughed, a cold, dismissive sound. "The universe? Are you kidding me right now? What about your husband? Didn't you say he had a vasectomy?" "I'm telling him it failed," I admitted, my voice small. He stared at me, his expression hardening. "So, you're tricking him into raising my kid? That's your grand plan?" "We were fucking, Lena. That's it. If I wanted a kid with you, I wouldn't have spent nearly $1,000 on plan B. Count me out." After that conversation, he was gone. His number was disconnected. When I drove by his apartment building, the concierge informed me he'd moved out. He wanted nothing to do with me or the baby. The message was crystal clear. The doctor's appointments were the worst. Silas insisted on coming to every single one. He'd ask a million questions and beam with pride when we heard the steady thump, thump, thump of the heartbeat. Once, the doctor casually mentioned genetic testing. Panic seized me, cold and sharp. I almost choked right there on the examination table. "We don't need that," I said quickly, my voice higher than usual. "Neither of us has any family history of genetic issues." The doctor gave me an odd look but didn't push it. Silas, ever trusting, just nodded in agreement. By my 3rd trimester, the lies were so tangled I sometimes lost track of what I'd told to whom. His friends threw him a dad-killer party where they gifted him tiny baseball gloves and father-son matching t-shirts. His mother knitted blankets with the family name monogrammed in the corner. I smiled through it all, a gracious and glowing mother-to-be, all while the truth churned in my stomach like acid. The alternative, telling the truth, seemed impossible. I'd gone too far. And despite everything, a delusional part of me truly believed it could work. Silas would love this baby no matter what, right? Once the baby was born, we'd just move forward as a family, and eventually, the truth wouldn't even matter anymore. The night before my due date, Silas held me close in bed, his hand resting on my enormous belly. "I never thought I could be this happy, Lena," he whispered into my hair. "Thank you for giving me a family." I swallowed hard against the lump in my throat, tears pricking my eyes. For one brief, terrifying moment, I considered confessing everything, coming clean and begging for his forgiveness. But then the baby kicked, a strong, definitive movement against his palm, and Silas's face lit up with such pure, unadulterated joy that I couldn't bring myself to shatter his world. "I love you," I said instead. The words felt both true and like the biggest lie I'd ever told. My water broke at 3 a.m. The hours that followed were a chaotic blur of pain and adrenaline. The frantic rush to the hospital, the increasingly intense contractions, and Silas holding my hand through it all. He looked terrified but was determined to be my rock. "You're doing great, Lena," he kept saying, his voice a steady anchor in the storm. "Our baby is almost here." Our baby. The phrase echoed in my head as I pushed, screamed, and finally, after 9 months of carrying this secret, delivered the child into the world. The delivery room went completely silent. I knew. Even before I saw him, I knew. I knew from the suddenly guarded expressions on the nurses' faces. I knew from the doctor's carefully neutral tone as he worked. And I knew from the way Silas's hand, which had been gripping mine with life or death intensity, suddenly went limp. "It's a beautiful baby boy," the doctor announced, his voice attempting a cheerfulness that didn't reach his eyes, as he held up my son. My beautiful, healthy, and clearly mixed-race son. Silas stood frozen, his face a mask of utter shock as he stared at the child that was so obviously not his. His mother, who had insisted on being in the room, let out a sharp, audible gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. There must be some mistake," she whispered, her horrified gaze flickering between Silas, with his pale skin and light brown hair, and the baby with his beautiful olive skin and shock of dark, curly hair. But there was no mistake. There was only the truth, finally exposed in the most undeniable way possible. Silas didn't say a word. He didn't shout or accuse me. He simply dropped my hand, turned, and walked out of the delivery room. His mother, after one last look of utter contempt in my direction, followed him, leaving me alone with my newborn son and a room full of uncomfortably silent medical staff. I held my baby close, tears streaming down my face, not just for the beautiful new life I'd created, but for the absolute, irreparable disaster I'd made of everything else. Hours later, they wheeled me to my recovery room. Silas was waiting there. He was standing by the window, his back to me, but I could feel the rage radiating off him in cold waves. It was an anger I'd never seen before, controlled and terrifyingly calm. "How long?" he asked, his voice flat without turning around. "Silas, I can explain." "How long?" he repeated, louder this time, finally facing me. I flinched, clutching the baby, whose name was Rowan, closer to my chest. "About 7 months," I admitted, my voice a pathetic whisper. "It wasn't supposed to happen. It was just a fling that got out of control." He laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that held no humor. "A fling? A fling that happened while I was at home, recovering from a vasectomy you insisted I get? I didn't force you to get it." I shot back a pathetic flare of defensiveness. "You agreed to it." His eyes widened at my audacity. "Because I trusted you, Lena. Because I thought we were a team, making decisions together for our future. And the whole time, you were sleeping with someone else." I looked down at my son, his perfect little face, peaceful in sleep, blissfully unaware of the hurricane he'd been born into. "Silas, I know you're angry, but can we please talk about this later? I just gave birth." "No," he said, his voice shaking with a fury he could no longer contain. "We're talking about this now. I spent the last 6 months reading books, building a nursery, and letting myself get excited about being a father. I called my mother, crying with happiness, when you told me you were pregnant. Do you have any idea what you've done to me? To my family?" Tears I didn't want him to see slid down my cheeks. "I made a mistake, a terrible mistake. But this baby isn't a mistake. He deserves a father who loves him, and you would be so amazing at that. Don't throw everything we have away because of one error in judgment." "One error?" He laughed again, that same horrifying sound. "Lena, you manipulated me into getting a permanent medical procedure. You cheated on me for months. You looked me in the eye and lied to me every single day. You tried to trick me into raising another man's child. That's not one error. That is who you are." His words hit me like a physical blow. "So, what are you saying?" He walked back to the window, staring out at the city lights. "I'm saying I'm done. I'll be filing for divorce as soon as possible." "You can't be serious," I stammered, panic rising in my chest. "This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Silas, please, we can work through this." He turned to face me one last time, and I was shocked to see that tears were streaming down his own face, carving paths through his mask of anger. "There is nothing to work through. You've shown me exactly who you are, and it's not someone I can spend my life with." He glanced at the baby in my arms, his expression unreadable. "But Rowan is not my responsibility. He deserves better than starting his life in a lie. And so do I." With that, he walked out of the hospital room, leaving me alone with my son and the smoldering wreckage of my life. The divorce was quick and brutal. It turned out Silas had harbored suspicions for months, my sudden secrecy with my phone, the late nights, but had been too trusting to act on them. Once the truth was out, his lawyer was merciless. My deception about the vasectomy and the pregnancy was used as leverage for a settlement that left me with barely enough to get by. The social fallout was just as swift. Everyone took his side. Friends I'd had for years stopped returning my calls. His mother, who had once treated me like a daughter, blocked my number. Even my own parents were coldly disappointed, my mother asking me through tears how she had raised someone capable of such profound deception. I moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment with Rowan. Single motherhood was nothing like I had imagined. It was exhausting, isolating, and relentlessly constant. Without Silas's income, I was struggling financially for the first time in my adult life. Maternity leave ended too quickly, and I was thrown into a frantic juggling act of daycare costs, rent, and formula, all while running on 3 hours of sleep a night. After 6 months of this bleak new reality, I decided to try dating again. How hard could it be? I was still young, still attractive despite the baby weight I couldn't seem to lose. I downloaded Tinder, created a profile, and made sure to mention Rowan, figuring that honesty was the best policy going forward. The responses were a wake-up call. Single mom? Hard pass. No offense, but I'm not raising another dude's kid. You're cute but seem like damaged goods. Too much baggage. One guy actually told me I had a salvage title, like a car that's been in a wreck. The few men who did agree to meet would invariably ghost after the first date when the reality of my limited availability and the sheer exhaustion etched on my face became clear. Meanwhile, I stalked Silas's social media like it was my job. 6 months after our divorce was finalized, he'd started his own successful tech company. 8 months in, he posted pictures with a new woman younger than me, no kids, laughing at something he'd said. By the 1-year anniversary of our divorce, they were engaged. The final blow came when I ran into them at a restaurant. I was out with Rowan, trying to have one normal meal. I was exhausted, wearing yoga pants and a t-shirt with a faint stain on the shoulder. She was glowing in a sundress, her hand resting possessively on Silas's arm. They looked happy. Genuinely, effortlessly happy in a way Silas and I never had been. When Silas spotted me, his expression shifted from shock to something that looked an awful lot like pity. He said something quietly to his fiancée and then walked over to my table. "Lena," he said, his voice formal. "How are you?" "Great." I lied, painfully aware of the baby food I'd just discovered in my hair. "Really great." His eyes moved to Rowan, who was happily smashing crackers into his high chair tray. Something flickered across his face. Regret, maybe, or just a quiet acknowledgement of what could have been. "He's beautiful," Silas said quietly. "I hope you're both doing well." "We are," I said, forcing a smile. "And congratulations on your engagement. She seems nice." She is," he said simply, and the unspoken comparison, "she is nice, unlike you," hung in the air between us. "Take care, Lena." I watched him walk back to his table, back to his new life, a life that didn't include me or my mistakes, and for the first time I truly deeply understood what I had thrown away. That night, after I put Rowan to bed, I scrolled through old photos on my phone, back to the early days with Silas. I thought about how differently everything could have turned out if I had just been honest. About not wanting children with him, about my dissatisfaction, about all of it. For one crystalline, agonizing moment, I saw myself with perfect clarity, not as the victim of circumstance I'd painted myself to be, but as the sole architect of my own destruction. I had taken a good, kind man who had loved me unconditionally, and I had systematically manipulated and destroyed him, all because I was too selfish and cowardly to face the truth. The clarity didn't last. By morning, I was back to telling myself that Silas had been too boring, that our marriage was doomed anyway, that everything had worked out for the best because now I had my beautiful son, Rowan. The familiar comfort of blaming others settled back around me like an old, worn blanket. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when Rowan is sleeping peacefully in his crib and I'm alone with my thoughts, that brief, terrible flash of self-awareness returns. In those moments, I wonder if I'll ever have the courage to truly face what I've done, or if I'll spend the rest of my life running from the simple, devastating truth. I didn't just lose a husband. I destroyed a good man, and no amount of justification will ever change that.